So I just today wanted to cover, background on, first of all, can you see the whole screen, or you have a black box on the side? I'll hide it.
I can see it.
Okay. So why did we update the NRI? Joyce touched on that, and we went back and forth about the reasons for it and the benefits of it. I'll give an overview of what's in the reference portion of it, all the natural resources that are included in this plan, the part, why they're important to the community. There's a separate document that's a site assessment checklist and a project review guide that will be specifically used in project review. And we'll end up with what are the next steps for the town and for the town board, for the conservation board and the other boards, and making the most of this process. So why update the natural resource inventory? Conservation boards by law are required to maintain an inventory and map. When they are created as a conservation commission, they need to create this inventory, and once it's done, the town board adopts it as the open space index, and the conservation board at that time has the authority to review development proposals that affect any resources that are identified in the open space index. So the open space index is really the maps that are incorporated in a natural resource inventory, and it's important to keep those up to date. When we finished the open space master plan, the maps in that plan became the open space index. These maps incorporate a lot of those. There's into a new document that can be known as the natural resource inventory. Currently, the town has a natural resource inventory that's referenced in the town code and defined in the town code, and it's specifically referring to the 2011 document that included about 6 different maps. This is an example of one of them. It wasn't as complete as the town conservation board wanted. It really focused on wetlands. It had a map of woodlands. It showed the streams and the lake, but it didn't include a lot of the other resources that the conservation board felt should be considered in development review and in a comprehensive natural resource inventory. So we pulled together a new natural resource inventory that has really 4 parts. The maps and description of resources can be used as the open space index. It identifies those areas of town that have significant resources that should be considered when reviewing development. The second part of the main document describes why this resource is important, what might be a threat to each of those resources, what are some best practices that can help protect the resource. And we've also wanted to reference existing regulations as well as organizations that have a role in protecting the resource. Throughout the process of creating this natural resource inventory, we were really trying to focus on the role of the conservation board as distinguished from the role of the town's engineer that's very specifically looking at flooding and stormwater management, as well as DEC and wetlands regulation. We wanted to make sure that the conservation board had the tools to evaluate impacts on resources that might not be as rigorously evaluated by those other entities through their typical project review roles. And then the site assessment checklist is a tool to help the conservation board and others to find out what resources are on a site, and we recommend using that in conjunction with the Ontario County Encore. And then the project review guide, which assesses the impact and asks the right questions to make sure that the project is designed in a way that minimizes impacts on important natural resources. So just to walk through it, you've seen a draft. There is an updated draft available that was done in March. I think the one you're looking at was done in February. But all of the resources that are covered in the natural resource inventory are the natural communities. That's based on land cover, wetlands, woodlands, including the strategic farmland protection area that was delineated in the open space plan, fields and shrubs, wildlife corridors, as well as the water resources, all important to Canandaigua in particular, the Canandaigua Canandaigua Lake watershed and shoreline, the subwatersheds, the buffers along streams. We added a map of farm ponds as well as groundwater resources. Cultural is a category that includes historic resources, scenic resources. We looked at protected and public land and made sure those were documented, as well as resources that were already subject to regulation, floodplains and wetlands. And we mapped as well the steep slopes with the categories aligning with the town's law on steep slopes, sand and gravel, as well as farmland. These are all the maps. I'll just show you examples. I'm not going to discuss these, but these are all in the plan: woodlands and wetlands, stream categories, watersheds. In the open space plan, we created a map of wildlife corridors, and it's packaged into the natural resource inventory, as well as the agricultural protection areas identified in the ag plan, all pulled together for the natural resource inventory. We created a new map showing existing gravel areas, abandoned pits, and former gas wells, as well as the steep slopes, historic resources, and land visible from Canandaigua Lake. Again, all those maps, most of those maps were in the open space plan. Some were created new for this project. So the first part is the natural resource overview. And if there's any questions about anything particular, we can go back, but I didn't want to dwell on that since you had access to it prior to this meeting. So the second part is, why are these resources important? What are the threats? What are some best management practices and the existing protections for these resources? This is intended to, as a resource for conservation board members and others. As you know, people come and go on these boards, and we were hoping that this could be a resource and a reference for new members, as well as a refresher for existing members, in a way to just keep current on the science and the specifics of what resources are in the town. The site assessment checklist asks for each site what resources are on the site. If it's not evident from the mapping, do we need additional information, or do we need to consult other references? We had a wonderful presentation by Sherry Norton of Ontario County on the Encore system, and they've really made some advances in using the Encore system itself as a site assessment. I will demonstrate how their system works, and what I recommend is that both tools be used together. A lot of the information that the site assessment checklist asks for can be obtained through the Encore, so it's just two different ways of looking at it. And we always wanted to make it perfectly organized, so it's just seamless and easy, and it's not perfect, but I think we're closer to being organized in our approach and helping the Conservation Board systematically review the resources available on a site. So our checklist is organized this way. What is the resource? What specific information does the board need to understand the resource, and where can you find that information? For example, for land cover, what are the natural communities? Are any of them rare or vulnerable? And where can you find that out? Encore has that information. They're also published in the reference. You can look at aerial photos, and you might need to go to the site to check for characteristic plants and animal species. Again, for watersheds, what watershed is it in? How much of it is in each watershed, and where can you get that information? That's another item that Encore provides. So just to run through the Encore, and if anybody hasn't looked into that, I recommend it. It's very interesting. If you go to Encore, you look for the County Planning Board Exploratory Summary, and that's available to anybody in the public. So you look for that tool, click on that. You can either search for a parcel or zoom in. I just happened to click on a parcel more or less randomly and ran the example using that as a model. So this parcel happened to be, have a tiny bit of silver maple ash swamp, which is one of the rare and vulnerable communities in the town of Canandaigua. This is an extract from an Encore report. It tells you how many acres of different ecological communities, whether there's any state or federal regulated wetlands, or whether there's any flood zones. These are all questions in the checklist. And it also shows a little map. So this map shows, obviously the parcel is almost entirely farmland, but you can see on the north side, there's a little bit of the woodland that goes into the parcel a little bit, and to the north is the silver maple ash swamp. It abuts that woodland, which is a valuable woodland in the town. So if there was a project on this site, that would be something the Conservation Board would take into consideration. The Encore also tells you what watershed it's in. So this tells you that it's in the Canandaigua Lake watershed. The property drains into Sucker Brook, which is a tributary Canandaigua Lake. It tells you how much of the land has various slopes, steep, moderate, gentle, and whether where to find out more information about rare plants or any environmental facilities on the site, and remediation sites. And it also includes the full soils mapper information. So we can find out if there's any hydric soils, which are a marker for federal wetlands, or whether there's erodible soils. And they have little maps for each of those soil characteristics. So the Encore is a great tool for site assessment, and you know, it's an 11-page report, so you get used to sifting through the information to find the ones that are most pertinent, and that's why I recommend it's used in conjunction with the site assessment checklist to just fill in and answer those questions based on Encore, and then you can find out what gaps are left when you're through with Encore. Are there any other information that you might have to go to the site to find out? So once you understand the site, the next step is to understand how the project will affect the resources on the site. So we've prepared a guide to walk through the questions that a board or anybody reviewing a project for impacts would need to answer. And a lot of the information for this project review guide is in the environmental assessment form that would be filled out by the applicant along with the project application. So the first question is, will any natural vegetation be removed? And if so, how will that impact, you know, the various resources? For example, if you're taking out certain trees that are characteristic of one of the special ecological communities, that would be significant. Are you removing trees from a significant woodland? Are you removing vegetation that might affect a wetland or a stream buffer or a steep slope? Vegetation removal could also affect views from a public area or public facility. So the second question is, will the project change the amount of impervious surface or alter drainage patterns? This is certainly something that the town engineer looks at through the stormwater management lens. But the other aspect of it is, you know, how does it affect ecological communities? You know, I think the engineers are typically more focused on flooding and managing floodwater, but we also need to consider that the flows onto the site and off of the site maintain the drainage flows that are needed for ecology, such as wetlands or stream habitats. So the impact on the ecological community would be the focus of the conservation boards, supported by the analysis of stormwater management by the town engineer through stormwater regulations. The third question, will the project affect agricultural resources? This might include conversion of farmland, but it also might include fragmentation of farmland or impacts on agricultural infrastructure such as drainage, tiles, ditches, or access roads. These are questions that you think become a custom of asking after the agricultural plan was done, and they're incorporated in the natural resource inventory as well. And fourth, will the project affect any cultural resources? Is it visible from a park or trail? Maybe the project is close enough to a trail that additional access can be designed as part of the project. any impacts on scenic views or historic resources. So the project review guide looks at how the proposed project might impact the natural resources identified in the natural resource inventory. So this is how the project review guide is organized. This is just an example. Ecological communities, wetlands is a separate section. So we had one of our ecologists at Labella, add to the potential mitigation that the town might consider for each of these topics that would help design a project to minimize impacts on the natural resources. So removal of vegetation is really the key part, because vegetation is integral to soil erosion prevention, wildlife habitat, visual impact. And so these are some mitigation approaches to be sure to incorporate into the project design. And sometimes this can be a question of the applicant, or a request, or even a condition of approval. For example, limiting tree removal to winter months to avoid disturbing bat habitat, retaining edge habitat. So it's not just the trees in the midst of a wooded area, but on the edge too, avoiding fragmentation, which isn't something that would typically show up, on a map, because you have to look at the larger corridors, and restoring sites with native vegetation. And we did include in the NRI an appendix with a list of native plants that we'd also encourage you to include in your project review guide. So that's just a really brief overview. I wanted to keep it simple because you've had a chance to look at it and might have some questions about specific aspects of it. But the next step would be for the town board to adopt the NRI to replace the 2011 document, and also amend the zoning to reference the updated NRI. The Conservation Board, as well as the Planning Board, ZBA, Town Board, and town staff are encouraged to use this as a reference, the maps and descriptions, as well as the site assessment and project review guides. The site assessment, as I mentioned, is best used in conjunction with Encore to understand what resources are on the site. And the project review guide needs to be used in conjunction with the environmental assessment form submitted with the application, which answers a lot of the questions about how this project will affect resources and what resources might be near the project site. Other steps are to work with Ontario County to develop a custom tool. They're still constantly tweaking their Encore and trying to make it as friendly and helpful as possible for boards and the public to understand and to use. So there can be more done to develop a custom tool for the town to simplify or streamline even more the questions that need to be answered to properly review a project. One thing, the Encore's steep slope categories are slightly different than those in the town regulations, so we'd like them to update their categories to align with the towns, at least for the town's use. And also the land cover mapping is dated by now, especially in the town of Canandaigua. So the town would need to work with Tom Harvey of the county planning. Apparently, Bruce Gilman is still doing these updates, and be great to take advantage of that and update the mapping based on current aerial photos. And we have provided Ontario County with the shapefiles. We need to follow up with Sherry further to make sure they have the documentation needed to go along with the shapefiles that we've provided. There's ongoing training, certainly. I think during this process, the Environmental Conservation Board's been able to get better information earlier in the process, but that's something that just needs to be constantly tweaked and kept in mind for everybody involved. These are important questions. The natural resources are important to the community, and the information needs to be given to the Environmental Conservation Board early in the process so they can undertake these investigations and consider the site design impacts of the project early. As you all know, once the project is design. It's hard to get the applicant to go back and redesign, but if we can get questions and concerns to the applicant early, a lot of times good design can avoid impacts on resources that you might not have thought of if you weren't looking at it through this lens. And certainly to have periodic training for all town boards about, you know, why these resources are important. There's a lot to think about in a project. You're certainly thinking about traffic, you're thinking about drainage, you know, noise, but certainly the impacts on natural resources and cultural resources are important and need to be considered in all aspects of project review. So continue with training, communication, coordination. It's easy to say, but hard to do. So encourage that to be done on a periodic basis. We were going to have a training session, right, Sarah? And that was going to be in April, so maybe we'll still do that. Okay, and that's it for now. I want to have any questions?